myself, but I appreciate landowners who are testifying and think they all should be able to.
I'm sorry, can you move the mic forward?
Sure.
Go ahead and move it around wherever you want. We just want to make sure.
I know I have a soft voice.
Oh, you're fine. Just make sure you're speaking into it. The parties will ask you some questions later, so you can move that around as you will. We just want to make sure our court reporter can hear you so that we can capture everything on the record.
Okay, is this better?
You're great.
Okay, and I also want to thank you for allowing me to change my testimony from August to today. Again, it happened because I needed to be at Mayo Clinic with my son for surgery, and on August 30th, which went well, thank goodness. But it coincidentally enabled me to hear testimony from the other landowners and the summit witnesses, which has been extremely helpful to me in preparing my testimony. So thank you for that. And thank you to your staff. They've all been very nice when I've called with questions. Lizzie has been great, so you've got a great staff, and I thank you.
Thank you. We do have great staff.
Okay. Should I introduce my exhibits first, or?
Sure, we can do that.
Okay.
And they've been distributed, I believe. Does everybody have them? Some are nodding yes.
Okay.
Or everybody's nodding yes. Yeah. Do you want to? You can briefly describe them, if you'd like, or we can admit them and you can work through them.
Well, I would ask you to admit them all, and it might be helpful to briefly describe them before I start into my testimony.
We'll see if anybody objects to them being admitted. Are there objections?
Your Honor, we would object to exhibits 2, 4, 13, 14, and 15 for lack of foundation.
2, 4, 15. I'm sorry, 2, 4,
13,
13,
14,
14,
and 15.
and 15.
Let's work backwards.
So 2.
I thought I read that the board would allow me to submit articles.
So so the parties can object to it,
yes.
And then you can, what lawyers would say, lay the foundation or explain the testimony, if you will.
Sure.
But also, when you're working in administrative law, and especially when you're working with clients, or not clients, folks that aren't represented by lawyers, they get considerable latitude in what they admit. So you can lay the foundation if you'd like and explain those, or you can explain it as we go.
I can quickly respond, and then if, and I'll go into further detail in my testimony.
That's fine. So Exhibit 2.
Okay, sorry, I was starting from the back. Exhibit 2 is my son. He will be an heir to the land. He also has a bachelor's in mechanical engineering, a master's in business administration, a PhD in mechanical engineering, and his specialization is in multi-phase fluid flows. He can define multi-phase fluid flows much better than I can, but it is directly relevant to the movement of CO2 through the pipeline. In this document, he doesn't refer to some other experience he's had with pressure vehicles and welds, but he does have knowledge of that too. I am concerned about safety. I am concerned about the economics of this project.
So don't testify. Just
okay.
You explained what that is. That's perfect. And then you're fine. Okay. Exhibit 4. Just a brief description of what that is.
Exhibit 4 is a letter from the family that lives on the acreage that is surrounded by my farmland.
Okay.
It's the acreage where I grew up.
Okay. And Exhibit 13.
Sorry. Oh, Exhibit 13. My husband is a American College of Laboratory Animal Medicine board certified veterinarian. He, in his paid working life, he worked for both the USDA and he worked for Iowa State University in laboratory, in laboratory animal medicine. Also has a master's in veterinary pathology. And the AVMN guidelines for the euthanasia of animals, while you think it's just about animals, it is not. CO2 is used.
Don't testify.
Oh, okay.
Just describe
Sorry.
it. All right, and then, no, you're fine. Exhibit 14.
Okay. This is a quote from Successful Farming magazine by my neighbor, Wally Taylor, who is a retired climatologist at Iowa State University.
Okay, and Exhibit 15.
Okay. Sorry, I've got them out of order now. My understanding was that I could submit articles, so I just pulled a few Google articles about other uses for CO2.
Okay. Are there objections other than the objections previously stated by Summit? Mr. Dubinsky, your card's up. Did you have one? Sorry. All right. With the previous exhibit or previous objections noted, the board will admit Burkgren hearing exhibits 1 through 15.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead. So now turning back to our questions, now that we have your exhibits in, can you describe the current use of your property and any plans you may have for different use in the future?
And I'm here to protect my family's farmland. My grandparents purchased this farm in 1923, and it's easy for me to remember that date because my father was born on the acreage that my farmland surrounds in 1923. He lived there.
So sorry, that's the acreage is that area carved out of the east parcel.
Yes, it's carved out from the east parcel.
East 40, is that what you call it?
The east 40.
There we go.
Yes.
All right.
And as I said, he, other than right after my parents married, he lived there his entire life from birth to death. My family moved to the farm in 1956 when my brother was a baby, and my mother continued to live on the acreage that is carved out on the East 40 until after my father died, and that's when the acreage was sold off. My brother and I inherited the farm. I bought his half of the farm because my son was the only one interested in the grandchildren in farming it at that time. Our plan is for it to go to the 4th and 5th generations someday. It's been rented to my tenant for over 30 years. And Exhibit 1 is a questionnaire that I prepared for him, asking questions about the farm, because honestly, he knows more after 30 years than I probably do. And he has had the land since he's been renting it in croplands, corn, beans, and oats on a rotation basis. And that's what we plan to continue doing if there is no pipeline on the ground. Now, at one time when I first inherited the farm, my son was considering moving there, building a house on the West 40, and starting his engineering consulting business. Since then, he has put those plans aside because of his diagnosis of stage 4 cancer. But right now, he has no evidence of disease, and so I don't think he will revisit those plans, but I would never say never because he has a strong emotional attachment to the farm. The proposed route on the farm, if he did reconsider, would directly affect his plans. If eminent domain is granted to the cement company, I would consider putting the land that is covered by the route into CRP to give the soil the best chance of recovering. However, there is no guarantee that I would be able to get it into CRP, but I think that would be the safest way to protect my tenant.
Okay, thank you. Just reviewing this exhibit real quickly here, so we're not redundant. So just moving through the questions I've got in front of me here. Other than the acreage, there's no buildings or structures on the east or west 40?
No, there are not.
Okay. And do you know where the drainage tile is located?
Yes, if you will refer to my exhibits, and I'll get the numbers here for you. Exhibit 5 shows some of the tiling. That's the newer tiling. I believe it was put in 2012. That is a plastic tile. And there, on subsequent pages, it tells what is clay and what is plastic and the size of those tiles. And exhibit 6 is a very old tile map. I don't know if my father drew this or his father or the person who did the tiling at that time. But just to show you how old it is, it's falling apart.
Okay.
Okay.
And then exhibit 1 indicates that the tile is 4 to 6 feet deep. Is that sound good?
Yes.
Okay. And which tiles are 6 feet deep?
I wish my tenant was allowed to testify because he could tell you. I do not know.
Okay. Okay. Are there any other underground installations on either property? Gas lines, water lines, telecommunication, anything?
To my knowledge, there is a rural water line along the south edge. I have not been able to get a hold of Xenia to confirm that.
Okay.
But my tenant suggested that there was. That's on the south border along both parcels.
Thank you.
There is a county drain tile that is not affected by the current route that runs along the east border of the east parcel, the east 40. There's also an easement along there for Highway 169. And on the west border of the west 40, I just learned yesterday, after going back through the abstract that I had to go to the lawyer's office to get, that there is actually, I believe it's called an overhang easement along that west border. There is a power line that goes through my neighbor's property to the west, and there is a 66-foot easement along our property line just for the overhang of that wire.
Okay, can staff zoom in there on that west? I think we can see one of the, start to see. Okay, there we go. So you see that structure just north of the gravel road on the west edge there. That's the transmission line you're talking about.
That's the transmission line.
Okay, and you're saying,
Now you can see it.
and you're saying 66 feet into your property.
Yes.
Okay.
And I was not aware of that until, as I said, until I looked at the abstract yesterday.
Sure. Okay. Thank you. Are there any other features or conditions on the east or west 40 that may not be readily apparent? Ditches, gullies?
Yes. There is an area that has a tendency to pond. And it is on the west 40. And I found a really good picture on Beacon that shows that from 2009, which I believe was a wet year. I know 2010 was a very wet year. That's Exhibit 7.
Thank you.
If you can pull that up. There's the pond. And that is definitely in the path of the pipeline.
Okay.
According to my tenant, that takes a couple of weeks to dry out after a rain event. And he said with compaction of soil from construction equipment, it could take a month to dry out in a wet year.
So that pond spot arcs from the northwest corner to the northeast corner, almost to the middle of the field.
Yes, and then down to it would be the east border of my property, abutting the acreage.
Okay, there's
it's
a waterway that extends
there's a
from the
natural
acreage.
waterway. The water tends to move south naturally.
Okay, so it moves out of that pond towards the acreage, or from the acreage towards the pond?
It moves toward the acreage.
Okay.
But there is some drainage tile through there that helps mitigate it, so it isn't ponding quite as badly there, but you can get some pretty wet spots there where your cursor is right now, which is, yes, right there by the, it would be the southwest corner of the acreage.
Can you describe any specific concerns you may have, or any recommendation you may have for the board as it relates to the siting of the pipeline on your property?
Yes. I have a number of concerns. If you pull up Exhibit 11, after listening to the testimony on the computer of people who've talked previously, I learned that some people have been unable to get insurance. And by the way, my name is misspelled on that exhibit under the subject line. It should be an R instead of a C. So I decided to contact my insurance company. And this is the email response that my insurance agent got. That I won't be able to get insurance on my farmland, almost 90 acres of it, if the pipeline goes through.
Say that again.
According to this response that my insurance agent received from my insurance company, I will be unable to get insurance on my farmland for my entire farm if this pipeline is put on my property.
Okay.
And this is documentation that she received and forwarded to me.
So for Exhibit 11, What type of insurance were you inquiring about?
I have liability insurance. So, for example, if a hunter would go on the land without permission and be injured and try to sue me, I'd have liability insurance. If there was an accident on the land and my tenant was injured or someone working with him was injured and tried to sue me, I would have liability insurance.
Okay.
I also have concerns about the use of eminent domain. I, in my opinion, do not feel that this is a public convenience or necessity, and I will probably address that further. But I feel there are many better options that don't require damage to our farmland. Iowa farmland is considered our most important asset in this state and a very important asset to our whole country because we're the breadbasket of the United States. I've often heard they're not making any more dirt, but they can make other things out of ethanol. I will talk more about how I've been treated by Summit representatives, but when they come to me and say that it's a negotiation in the United States where we have a free market is entered into freely. I did not freely want to negotiate, and when I'm forced into it, it becomes extortion instead of a negotiation. I am concerned about the proximity of the pipeline to the family who lives on the acreage. Even though we don't own the acreage, I still care about it. It's where I grew up. It's where my children loved to visit when my parents were both alive and living there. They get their water through a well. I have not actually met them in person. When I did not know the property had changed hands when they purchased it in 2016. Took a little while to find that out. Then the pandemic hit, and I did not want to visit them in person, and I had trouble getting a phone number for them because people don't answer their phones from strange numbers typically. But I have since talked to them just last week, found out they have 3 children still living at home. He has been on 4 deployments. He works for the Guard here in Fort Dodge. She is a nurse, which I think is, after our experience for the last 2 years, is a very noble profession. They try to live organically, holistically, raising as much of their food as they can on the land. And I fear for their safety if there should be any damage to the pipeline, either through a pinhole leak or through a rupture of any sort. After I talked to them, I asked them to write up, if they wanted to, they didn't have to, but to write something about how they felt it would affect them. And that's Exhibit 4. And I think I've already entered that into evidence. But I want them to be safe. It warms my heart to know that they love living there. And I want them to be able to continue living safely there. Then my next concern is financial problems. Summit has offered me payments. I've talked to their agents and actually quoted a rather outrageous number, which they did not offer to me. At my age and my husband's age, we have a financial plan, and the money that Summit is offering would not be healthy for that plan. A lot of the payment would go to reimburse my tenant for any crop losses, whether it's 3 years or 10 years. It would go to trying to restore the land, and it would go to taxes. Now, I'm not sure how it would be treated, if it was be income tax or capital gains tax. I've been trying to read IRS regulations, and I'm still not sure. And we're of an age where we are required to take Medicare. A payment of this amount would increase our what's called IRMA, which, and I'll have to read it, is the income-related monthly adjusted amount of premium. And that would be a big financial dent in our monthly budget. So financially, their offer hurts us. It doesn't help us. It also does not address the increasing value in the farmland. It only takes a snapshot of where we are now. And in fact, the offer that I have in the printed easement offer is about, let me think, 5,000 less than what a farm with a similar CSR2 sold for, which is located about 1.5 miles down the road. So their offer on the easement would be a burden rather than a benefit. On Exhibit 1, my tenant says that he would not be able to, he doesn't feel he could easily farm that West 40, that he'd be able to, wherever the pipeline divides the property. If he doesn't feel safe farming half of my farm, I lose the rental payments that are currently being used to pay for the loan that I took out to buy my brother's half of the farm and to pay the farm property taxes. If I can't make the farm payments, I'll have to sell my family farm. I don't think there's much fairness or justice in that. Even if I put it in CRP payments are less than rental payments. And you're locked into a rental plan for 5 years at a minimum, sometimes 10 years. And there's no guarantee you can get in. Looking into the future, when my children own this, when I'm not relying on this income for my retirement, it will go to my children. Both of them have had significant medical challenges, my daughter and her family, and my son, who's single. I wanted the farm to be an asset that would help to provide for them in case of emergency and for their retirements. With the pipeline going through, that threatens all of our financial well-beings. If the farm's value goes down, as I've talked to some people who have suggested it would with the pipeline on it, if anyone ever wanted to sell it, the value would be less than it would without the pipeline. And as I glanced upon, this farm is part of my retirement plan. If I outlive my husband, I hope I don't, but if I do, his pension goes away from me. And so I am relying on this asset, along with other assets, to take care of me when I retire. Now, going to the land itself, I'd like to talk about the compaction of the soil and the crop loss. And I'm going to admit that I should have paid a lot more attention growing up to the farm. I walked beans I helped go out in the field after the harvest and pick up the corn cobs that they didn't pick up, or the corn, not the cobs. But I didn't pay enough attention to drainage tile, to the health of the soil, and I've learned a tremendous amount from these hearings. I was particularly interested in what the soil scientist from Iowa State had to say. It was very educational. And from that, and then from reading other sources, I've learned about the importance of the subsoil. That there is no way right now to restore subsoil after it's been compacted by heavy construction equipment. Topsoil, you have a little bit better chance of restoring it. I read an article about what happens when roots go down through the topsoil and then hit that hard concrete-like subsoil, and it's not good. It affects fertility, it affects yield. The roots cannot access the water and the nutrition. According to my tenant, topsoil is about, I think he said, 12 inches deep. That's not very much soil for those roots to be growing on. I remember a couple years ago, as we were having a dry year, people talking about corn roots can go 8 feet down looking for water and nutrients. I know that a lot of cover crops put in very deep roots. They would be stopped by the compaction of the subsoil. And, sorry, I need to refer here. The construction of the pipeline would do permanent damage. Soil is a very complex structure. It's not just a handful of dirt that you pick up. The plants aerate the soil with their roots. Animals consume the plants, enrich the soil. And once the soil is disturbed, it is virtually impossible to get it back to where it was to start with. They can try, they can do some restoration, but one sign of human disturbance of the soil can be found in archaeological studies, because they use satellite images to find prehistoric settlements by looking for signs of stunted vegetation that indicate soil disturbance from ancient structures that rotted away centuries or even thousands of years before. There's peer-reviewed research that is showing that the use of heavy equipment results in deep soil compaction. And my son looked this up for me. A Caterpillar D9 bulldozer, which I think is a typical piece of construction equipment, weighs 55 tons. And that was from a quote from Caterpillar in 2023. There is also a study that shows there's no known method to reverse deep soil compaction, and that can cause yield reductions of up to 50%. Okay. And if there is a CO2 leak, and I'm thinking here of just a pinhole leak, it will cause significant fluctuations in soil pH, and it has lasting negative effects on both phosphorus and nitrogen concentrations in the soil. And a pinhole leak is much more likely than a rupture in a pipeline. And that I'm looking at Exhibit 2 and also Exhibit 3. Exhibit 3 is just a general statement from the Iowa Drainage District Association, which tells about the benefits of drainage. And I have significant concerns about damage to tile. And that document, I won't read it, you can read it yourselves, but it talks about plant roots, talks about soil surface temperatures, assisted by proper drainage, storm water runoff. Runoff from the soil would be reduced to neighboring areas. Soil bearing strength is increased, soil structure is improved. I'm not going to read them all, but suffice it to say, drainage is important. Our soil is important. I'm also concerned about holes in the ground that could develop if the pipeline would collapse, which is less likely than having a tile collapse because of damage to it from the pipeline being put in or existing there. I don't know if anyone here has ever seen a tractor in a hole in a field, but I have. My husband drove a tractor into a hole. Luckily, he got stopped before he went all 6 feet down, or he might not be here today. He doesn't drive tractors with cabs. Most of his equipment is 40 years old. And this is on our farm in Story County. It's not on the Webster County farm. So just to clarify that. But it caused a lot of damage to the tractor, and it took a lot of work getting the tile repaired and getting enough soil put back in there to fix the hole. So that's a danger to my tenant if this pipeline is put through. Okay, then I have concerns about the way I've been treated by Summit. And I will say there have been some very nice, respectful, compassionate people from Summit who have contacted me. There have been some people who have been just the opposite. They have lied to me, and they've, quite frankly, bullied me. The first one to contact me showed up in the driveway of my mother's house, and my mother lived 4 houses from me in Ames. And she was at the time the agent contacted me, she was the listed owner of the property because she had just died shortly before that. He showed up and told me how happy he was to see me and how much good he was going to do for me because he was going to give me this wonderful easement. When I said, well, the land is in my mother's estate, and we're just beginning to work through that process. And you should have seen his eyes light up. He seemed to realize that I was probably in a vulnerable state. I was grieving. And his attitude toward me at that point was, oh, you poor little lady. Missy, I'm going to take care of everything for you. You don't have to worry about a thing. Which, if you ask anybody that knows me, is the wrong way to approach me. I did not appreciate being patronized. I did not appreciate being ambushed, walking out of my mother's house after taking care of her cats and her plants, and trying to ask myself, where do I begin in handling all of this? We had no notice that he would show up, and that continued. According to the record that Keita, and I'm sorry I don't know her last name, obtained for me because I didn't know this existed, we've had 39 contacts with Summit. And I will say I have contacted them at times and met with them, trying to get more information, trying to give this as an impartial a viewing as possible, especially at first. It seems like far more than 39. And a lot of those, I was trying to be Iowa nice, be polite, but I frequently asked that they not contact me in person, not just show up on my doorstep, not call me, because not too long after my mother died, my grown son, who was 34 at the time, was diagnosed with stage 4 cancer. He went through a major all-day surgery. He and I lived in Rochester for 2 months while he was undergoing treatment. We later learned the cancer had recurred, and he was to get his affairs in order. After that, we were also told he was dying of malnutrition because he couldn't keep anything down because of the chemotherapy. We have had a miracle, and I do mean a miracle, and he now has no evidence of disease, even though, according to his doctor, he should have been dead by now. The last 2 years of my life have been extremely difficult. Unfortunately, Summit made it a lot worse. I appreciate the agents who contacted me with texts and emails as I requested. They were easier to deal with. But I've been told lies by the Summit people. One of the first people that I talked to told me that CO2 was not an asphyxiant because I asked about Satartia. It had come up in a news article I read. He told me that the problems in the Satartia pipeline were caused by something else that was naturally occurring in Mississippi. It wasn't the CO2. And that he knew because he had worked with pipelines in Texas or Oklahoma, or maybe both. That's obviously not true. One land agent told me that he needed me to respond to his calls and emails on a regular basis so that he could prove to his boss that he was doing his job. After listening to the hearings, I think this was probably just a ploy to make it look like Summit was doing their due diligence and trying to make lots of contacts with me and work with me. I've listened to employees of Summit testify here that they don't know who's on the board of directors. Multiple employees. And I find that very hard to believe because I worked for a number of years as the association director for an organization. Believe me, I knew every one of my board of directors, and I knew them pretty well. Another Summit representative told me, and this was early on, when I said, well, I'm not interested, I'll listen to you, I'll consider it, but I don't want to be forced into anything by eminent domain. He said, oh, well, we're going to have eminent domain. There's no question about it. He told me that the company had already spent way too much money on this project to ever let it fail. And that because they'd spent so much money on it, it would definitely go through. No questions asked. Now, if I'm investing money, which I don't really, I would assume that anybody who invests in Summit knows the meaning of a speculative investment. Summit did not have a permit when they were soliciting investors. And those investors had to know it was speculative. Stocks have a line saying, all investments involve risks, including possible loss of principal. I would think that Summit would have had to include that in any of their documents. If their investors didn't know that, those investors were being grossly negligent. I am concerned because Summit is not transparent. They claim that they should be treated like a public company, that this is for the public convenience and public necessity. But if they were a public company, they would be required to provide information to the public. I have listened to their testimony. I have heard vague, evasive answers. I've heard employees say they don't know, or that it isn't their area of expertise. And I have seen Summit, if someone tries to stand up to them, as I think at least one of the counties has been sued by them for trying to have zoning standards, they immediately file a lawsuit to try to shut it up. If Summit's plan is so wonderful, why not give me information? Why not give all of us information? Summit agents have told me I might as well sign, because otherwise Summit is going to use eminent domain to take my land, and that there's nothing I can do about it. I'm here to try to change that. And they've told me that under eminent domain, they're going to pay me a lot less than they're offering, and that I won't be able to negotiate any specific terms or requests into the easement contract. I have questions about the redundancy plan for when the Summit Carbon Solution alarm goes off. If there's a leak on my farm, are they going to shut down the pipeline immediately, or are they going to investigate first, allowing precious time to go by? Do they have somebody who's staying in the office while the other person leaves to deal with it? Without a redundancy plan, and they may have one, they haven't provided so I can see it, it adds additional risk. There's been secrecy surrounding water permits that Summit is trying to obtain, and I just learned about this about a week ago. Mr. Benz, who testified for the Office of Consumer Advocate, I hope I've got that right, said he didn't know anything about the applications for the water, but that it could be relevant to the Iowa Utility Board's consideration of public convenience and necessity. We're experiencing a drought right now, and the prospect is that it will get worse. And public access to clean, safe water is extremely important. On our land in Story County, we have a section that we were planning to farm. After we bought it, and we knew it was a wet spot, after we bought it, we found a sign that had fallen down saying that it was part of the drainage area for Ada Hayden Lake. If you're familiar with Ames at all, Ada Hayden Lake is the backup water reserve for Ames water. Once we learned that, we put that land into CRP. We did not want to farm it and endanger the water of our neighbors. These water permits, my understanding is that rather than request them under the Summit Carbon Solutions overall LLC, they created individual LLCs under names that did not say Summit Carbon Solutions. And I have to feel that that was another effort to hide information from the public. Back to the drought, we've already talked briefly when I submitted it. Exhibit 14. My neighbor happens to be Wally Taylor. He's a lovely gentleman. If you have listened to WHO Big Show over the years, you will have heard Elwin speaking there and on other stations and at extension events about climatology in Iowa. I'm quoting from an article written by Trevor Holbrook in Successful Farming in 2020. Using trends, the Midwest goes through a cyclical pattern for mild climate followed by turbulent climate conditions. And above that, he says a rise in temperature should shift into the Midwest within the next 5 years. So we're looking at 2025, possibly, as the headline says, could be a Dust Bowl year. I have also visited with Elwin in the past. We both tend to walk the same path sometimes. And I'd asked him, looking forward, should we be looking to plant drought-resistant crops? And he said, yes, definitely. Taking massive amounts of water that cannot then be replaced or might be chemically treated so that they wouldn't be safe would not be supportive of the public interest in access to clean water and adequate water supplies. I have concerns about pipeline safety. And, let me pull up. I'm looking for Exhibit 13. Exhibit 13 is a small portion of the AVM guidelines for the euthanasia of animals, and it's copyrighted 2020. CO2 is definitely an asphyxiant. It is used in euthanasia, and these guidelines, which veterinarians use, also refer to the effect of CO2 on humans, and that's why I'm submitting this. This was prepared by my husband, gave me the guidelines. He's a board-certified laboratory animal medicine veterinarian, so he has used these guidelines. Carbon dioxide causes pain due to the formation of carbonic acid. It produces air hunger, a feeling of breathlessness, and it causes direct stimulation of ion channels that is associated with fear response. And kind of an aside, it causes pain due to the formation of acid. When my son had surgery in August, they pumped air into his chest to do an abdominal surgery. And a nurse told me he was having a lot of pain afterwards, not from the incisions, but from the gas. And I think anybody that's had gallbladder surgery probably has experienced that. And then one nurse told me, and I don't know if this is right or not, that it was, that's the CO2 kind of forming and it just has to work out of the body, but that's what the pain is from. He was pretty uncomfortable. According to the AVMA, in humans, air hunger starts at concentrations as low as 8%. I hope that information from the AVMA is helpful. Okay. I am concerned that Summit refuses to even consider waiting for the new PHMSA regulations. And they work with hazardous pipelines, and I'm sorry, I wish I knew, I should have written down exactly what those letters stand for, but I do know they work with safety of pipelines on a federal level, and that they held hearings in May here in Iowa, and that they are working on new regulations. If Summit thinks that the pipeline is safe and that they're trying to work with the public, why aren't they willing to wait for the regulations to come out? It feels like they're trying to rush this project. I am concerned that they refuse to share their dispersion modeling and emergency plans. And I know there have been questions asked about rescue squads. So I called people I know in Webster County. In Dayton, they have 2 EMTs, but they're not available during the daytime because they work out of town. Coverage of southern Webster County is covered by an all-volunteer force out of Gallery. Harcourt is between my farm and Gallery. They have a very small force. The person I talked to thought it would take 20 minutes for them to get people together to get there to help. Dayton, the fire chief told me 10 to 12 minutes. He also told me that he has not heard anything from Summit. He's had rumors that they're talking to people, but only rumors. They haven't talked to them. Same thing in Gallery, the person I talked to there. They do have EMTs, they have no paramedics. If you need backup to the Gallery Rescue Squad, or if you need more, a paramedic rather than an EMT, Fort Dodge is 23 miles from my farm, 27 minutes road time. Boone, which would be the next closest, is 24 miles, and it's 30 minutes. Treatment, if you needed access to a hyperbaric chamber, and I honestly do not know. I know they treat carbon monoxide poisoning with hyperbaric chambers. I do not know if they can treat a carbon dioxide poisoning with a hyperbaric chamber, but it takes time to, they call it dive, to get to a pressure in a hyperbaric chamber. I do not know if they have any in Fort Dodge. They have at least 1 in Boone, maybe 2, and they have 2 in Ames. That's not very many hyperbaric chambers to cover the number of potential victims if there's a CO2 leak. If you look at Exhibit 2, and my son wrote this for me. As I said, he's got expertise in multi-phase fluid flows. The economics of the Summit project are iffy. There are peer-reviewed scientific studies that show it's 24% worse for the environment than drilling for oil. Now, I've liked ethanol. I like the idea of a renewable energy source. It's not looking good, though, for the future. Electric vehicles are on the way in. At least 10 states have banned combustion engines by 2030 something, and that there is a point of cost parity that is expected to be reached no later than 2026 with current technology, where electric vehicles and internal combustion vehicles will cost the same. And new battery technologies like solid-state electrolytes could push the costs dramatically lower than combustion engines. Electric vehicles are cheaper to make, cheaper to operate, they have fewer moving parts. Most major automakers say they will cease production of internal combustion engines no later than 2035. The point of maximum chemical fuel demand, according to a Bloomberg NEF article, is expected to be 2027. That's not very far away. So originally, ethanol was a stopgap measure. It is not and is never going to be able to compete with electric vehicles. Dr. Robert Brown, who is a well-known biofuels expert and professor at Iowa State University, in a lecture entitled "The Emergence of the Bioeconomy," also made this same point on September 3rd, 2008, that electric vehicles are the future. If that's the case, ethanol is on the way out until they can find other products. Burying it in the ground is not going to give ethanol a future. There are other technologies that are being developed and could be developed to use ethanol so that it is valuable. But burying it in the ground isn't that. According to an article about the Iowa poll, 78% of Iowans oppose this project. That's the public that is opposing this project. Even if the pipeline is built, we don't know that economically it's going to be feasible. Southern Company built and quickly abandoned a carbon capture pipeline in Mississippi because it was too expensive to operate. Research, and there's a quotation in the article, says that over 80% of such projects end in failure. Do we end up with an eminent domain pipeline in our ground that isn't needed and that is damaging to our ground? A pipeline to nowhere in many different ways. Back to safety. The National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health says that a lethal dose is 9% for humans. At that point, you have 5 minutes to live, although you probably would not be awake for more than about a minute or so. Inert gas asphyxiation kills at least 8 people per year in the United States. Some of those things are from something that you might think was as innocuous as a CO2 canister at your local McDonald's that happens to leak. There is a training video, I believe, from the Phoenix, Arizona area that was training firefighters because they reported to a person who they thought had fallen, but who is actually overcome by CO2. Again, on safety, it is more likely to be a pinhole leak than a rupture if the pipeline ruptures. I talked to someone from Summit, sent her emails, which she very kindly answered, asking about flow meters. because that would be a way to detect safety in a pipeline. Flow meters have an error rate of about plus or minus 1% at full measurement range. That's in a calibrated flow meter. They have to be recalibrated every year by the NIST. And if you want me to, I can look up what that stands for. It's a national certified lab for recalibration. A more realistic error rate, if they're not calibrated, is about plus or minus 5%. So if you assume a plus or minus 5% in an uncalibrated state, the proposed pipeline could leak 900,000 metric tons of CO2 every year, and none of us would know it. So that's CO2 that they're claiming to capture from the ethanol plant that's leaking out of their pipeline and going right back into the environment. Now, we would know it if somebody happened to walk close to that pinhole leak, say it was in a valley, and died of asphyxiation. The closest analog to a CO2 pipeline that we have at large scale are natural gas pipelines. Research has shown that natural gas pipelines leak between 1.4% and 2.3% of their total volume. And of course, natural gas is easier to detect because they're able to use a substance called methyl mercaptan, which makes it smell like rotten eggs. There have been questions about can't we just, that it's safer to put it in a pipeline rather than to put it in a train. Carbon dioxide can be and is being shipped by rail right now. They use insulated cryogenic tanker cars when they want to ship it at higher densities than via a pipeline. Now, a pinhole leak or a catastrophic rupture can also be possible on a train car. But the danger to human life would be significantly less because there is a limited volume, a lower volume than a pipeline, in a single rail car. And the limited volume and then the movement of the train would mix the leaked CO2 with a large volume of air. So it would be diluting it to a safe concentration. I think President Biden just announced that he was giving a lot of money to rail line safety too, yesterday or the day before. There are other serious ways to use carbon dioxide as a product in manufacturing, in making concrete, in making synthetic methane, feeding algae to produce synthetic jet fuel. Those would be important alternatives to consider for public convenience and public necessity. I want to talk a little bit about environmental impacts. This pipeline is likely to be a net emitter of carbon dioxide for at least the first 2.5 years. If you use carbon life cycle estimates for national gas pipelines, carbon emissions from building and operating a pipeline, the vast majority of which are associated with construction, is 67.14 ton of CO2 by, and this is a formula, km times 10 to the third power per year. That equates to approximately 21.5 million metric tons of CO2 that would be emitted by the pipeline construction and operation. It does not take into account the carbon that is sequestered in the soil by farming. But the best estimates are that good farming practices sequester 1.5 metric tons of CO2 per acre per year, and that disturbing the soil will release 15 years worth of sequestered carbon. If you assume an initial planned operating flow rate of 9.8 million metric tons per year, with construction planned to take 2 years and a few more years or a few more months to complete the regulatory and testing phase, the earliest the pipeline could break even on carbon emissions is mid-2028. Remember, 2035, they're not making combustion engines for cars anymore. So at that point in 2028, the ethanol market is probably already in a significant decline if we aren't finding other means of making products with the CO2 from ethanol plants. To the best of our knowledge, we don't know which production sources of CO2 are going to be captured and not captured at the ethanol plants. The agricultural equipment in the field, the transportation of the grain to the plant, the transportation of the ethanol from the plant, and the production of electricity used by the plant will not be captured. I know that someone would probably say they're going to use electricity from green sources, which is great. However, you could put that electricity directly into an electric vehicle without having to cycle it through the ethanol plant to try to come up with ethanol for your car. Okay, back to my other sheet. Thank you for your patience. Okay. So the economics of the pipeline, you've heard this before. We've heard some people say this pipeline isn't feasible without 45Q tax credits or other tax credits that the ethanol plants might get, which the ethanol plants might get those tax credits if they're capturing the carbon and using it for a product. We've recently seen, I think every 4 years or 8 years, when you get a new president, you see new administrations, new Senate and House of Representatives change what previous administrations have done. President Biden stopped oil leases in Alaska recently. We don't have any guarantee that those 45Q tax credits are going to continue to be available. For all I know, the House of Representatives right now might be saying, we've got to get rid of those if you want a continuing resolution on the budget. There's no cost benefit to this project. Okay, one of the questions that the board provided me was, what actions can the board take to address my concerns? Is that correct?
Yep, that was the question I just asked.
Yes, okay. Do not grant eminent domain for a private, for-profit economic gain of another party. Give us better communications. I will be honest, I get distracted sometimes by major medical questions and concerns. And when I received the last mailer, the cardboard one, announcing that I could attend these hearings, I thought it was another piece of junk mail, and I nearly threw it away. I didn't read it, and I had to call at the last minute to say, well, yes, I want to testify. I'm glad I didn't throw it away. But we need better communications from the IUB. I think the IUB should definitely delay making any decision until we have recommendations from PHMSA. And ideally, we would have guidelines from our governments about CO2 pipelines, because they are different from natural gas pipelines, from oil pipelines. If possible, and I suggested this to a Summit land agent, the pipeline should go in the public right-of-way rather than on our farms. That land is already not productive. I do not think that any company seeking a permit should be allowed to go on private property to do a survey until they actually have that permit. If you allow, in this case, Summit, to go on the land before they have a permit, that is implying that their plans are more important and more legitimate